The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape of Arizona territory. As Ayana crouched behind a cluster of prickly pear cacti, her dark eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The 18-year-old Apache woman had been running for 3 days now, her water supply dwindling and her strength fading with each passing hour. The rough terrain had torn her moccasins, and dried blood stained the leather where sharp rocks had cut through to her feet. Her village had been peaceful that terrible morning when the soldiers came. Ayana remembered the sound of hoofbeats thundering through the canyon, followed by shouting and gunfire that shattered the dawn quiet. She had been gathering herbs near the stream when the attack began, watching in horror as smoke rose from the wickiups where her family slept. The acrid smell of burning brush and worse things filled her nostrils as she pressed herself against the canyon wall, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. When the shooting finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over what had been her home for 18 years. Ayana waited until the sun was high overhead before creeping back toward the village, her heart pounding so hard she was certain any remaining soldiers would hear it. What she found there would haunt her dreams forever. Her grandmother's weathered hands lay still among the scattered corn-grinding stones. Her young cousin's favorite doll sat abandoned in the dirt, its corn-husk face stained with ash. The few survivors had scattered like startled quail, each fleeing in different directions into the vast wilderness. Ayana had grabbed what little she could carry, a water gourd, some dried meat, and her grandfather's hunting knife, before disappearing into the maze of canyons and mesas that had sheltered her people for generations. She knew these lands better than most, having learned every hidden spring and secret trail from her grandfather. But even that knowledge seemed insufficient now as she faced the prospect of surviving alone. For the first day, adrenaline had carried her forward, her legs moving automatically across the familiar terrain. She followed game trails through narrow passages between towering red rocks, always climbing higher, always moving away from the valley of death below. The second day brought the first real challenge as her water began to run low. The hidden springs her grandfather had shown her were still many miles away, and the relentless sun seemed determined to drain every drop of moisture from her body. By the third day, dehydration and exhaustion were taking their toll. Ayana's vision blurred as she stumbled across a flat expanse of desert floor, the heat shimmer making distant objects dance and waver like spirits. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and each step sent shooting pains through her torn feet. The dried meat she had brought was too salty to eat without water, so it remained untouched in her small bundle while her stomach cramped with hunger. The landscape around her seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. A sea of sagebrush, scattered cacti, and red sandstone formations that offered little shelter from the blazing sun. In the distance, purple mountains rose like sleeping giants, but they might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did her now. Ayana had been moving toward those peaks, knowing that higher elevation meant cooler temperatures and a better chance of finding water, but her strength was failing rapidly. As the afternoon wore on, she began to hear things that weren't there. Her grandmother's voice calling her name, the sound of water flowing over rocks, the familiar songs her mother used to sing while weaving baskets. These auditory mirages scared her more than the physical discomfort because she knew they meant her mind was starting to fail along with her body. Her grandfather had told her stories of travelers who had died in the desert, describing how the spirits would call to them, trying to lead them astray in their final hours. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Ayana spotted a cluster of juniper trees growing in what looked like a shallow depression in the ground. Trees meant water, or at least the possibility of water. So she changed course and stumbled toward them with renewed hope. As she drew closer, she could see that the trees were indeed growing around a small, seasonal wash, a place where water flowed during the rare desert rains. The wash was bone dry now, but Ayana knew that sometimes water could be found by digging in such places. Using her grandfather's knife in her bare hands, she began to scrape away the sand and gravel in the deepest part of the channel. The work was exhausting, and each scoop of earth seemed to require tremendous effort. But desperation drove her forward. After what felt like hours, her fingers finally encountered something different. Mud. Real, wet mud that meant water was somewhere below. She dug faster now, ignoring the way the rough sand abraded her already damaged hands. Soon, a small pool of muddy water began to form in the bottom of her improvised well. It wasn't much, barely enough to cup in her palms, but it was water, precious and life-giving. Ayana knew she should wait for the sediment to settle, but her thirst was too great. She drank the muddy liquid greedily, feeling it soak into her parched tissues like rain into drought-stricken earth. The water gave her enough strength to think clearly again, and she realized she needed to find better shelter for the night. The desert could be brutally cold after dark, and she had no blanket or warm clothing to protect her from the temperature drop. The juniper trees offered some protection from the wind, so she gathered dried branches and created a small windbreak between two of the larger trunks. As she worked, her mind wandered to her family, wondering if any others had survived, if anyone was looking for her, if she would ever see her homeland again. Night fell quickly in the desert, the temperature dropping so fast that Ayana could see her breath in the starlight. She curled up in her makeshift shelter, pulling her torn shirt tightly around her shoulders and trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in her belly. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear desert air, forming the same patterns her grandfather had taught her to read for navigation and timing. Looking up at them made her feel less alone, as if her ancestors were watching over her from their place in the sky. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by strange dreams and the sounds of the desert night. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling in an ancient song that seemed to mock her solitude. Once she thought she heard horses approaching and sat up in terror, but it was only the wind moving through the juniper branches, creating sounds that her frightened mind interpreted as hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every noise a potential enemy, and she dozed with the knife clutched in her hand. Dawn brought no relief from her desperate situation. The small amount of muddy water had helped, but she was still dangerously dehydrated, and now her hunger was becoming a serious problem. The dried meat she carried would only make her thirst worse, and she had seen no game animals in her 3 days of flight. Even if she had, she possessed no bow or spear to hunt with, and making such weapons would require time and materials she didn't have. Ayana forced herself to stand and begin walking again, though every movement sent waves of pain through her abused body. Her destination was still the distant mountains, where she hoped to find not only water and game, but possibly some of her scattered people. Many of the older Apache knew secret places in those peaks, hidden canyons with year-round springs and ancient cliff dwellings that could shelter fugitives from pursuing soldiers. The 4th day of her journey was the hardest yet. The sun seemed more merciless than ever, and the landscape offered no shade except for the occasional saguaro cactus or weathered boulder. Ayana's water was gone again, consumed in small, rationed sips throughout the previous day, and she had found no other sources. Her lips were so cracked that they bled when she tried to moisten them with her tongue, and her skin felt tight and papery from dehydration. By midday, she was stumbling more than walking, her vision blurring and her thoughts becoming confused. The mountains ahead seemed no closer despite hours of travel, and she began to wonder if she was walking in circles. The heat created shimmering mirages that made distant objects appear to dance and change shape, and more than once she veered off course, chasing the phantom image of a lake or stream that dissolved into nothingness as she approached. It was during one of these disoriented episodes that Ayana finally collapsed. Her legs simply gave out, depositing her in a heap among some scattered rocks beside a small arroyo. She lay there gasping, feeling the heat of the sun burning through her torn clothing and into her skin. This was how she would die, she realized. Alone in the desert, with buzzards as her only mourners. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt only a strange sort of peace, as if she was finally ready to join her family in whatever realm awaited beyond this world of pain and suffering. Above her, the sky was a brilliant blue dome, unmarked by even a single cloud. The silence was complete, except for her own labored breathing, and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Ayana closed her eyes and tried to remember her grandmother's voice, the songs her mother sang, the sound of children playing in the village. These memories seemed more real than her present circumstances, more solid than the rocks beneath her body. She might have died there, baked by the relentless sun until her body became just another set of bones scattered across the desert floor. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for the young Apache woman. As consciousness began to slip away from her like water through cupped fingers, a new sound reached her ears, the steady rhythm of horse hooves on hard-packed earth, growing closer with each beat. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through Ayana's fading consciousness like a knife through leather. Her survival instincts, honed by generations of Apache wisdom and 3 days of desperate flight, forced her eyes open despite the blazing sun overhead. Through the heat shimmer and her own blurred vision, she could make out the silhouette of a lone rider approaching from the east, leading what appeared to be a pack horse behind him. Fear and hope warred in her chest as she watched the figure draw nearer. It could be a soldier returning to search for survivors, in which case her ordeal would end in capture or death, but it could also be salvation. Someone with water and supplies who might help her reach safety. Either way, she was too weak to run, too exhausted to hide. Her fate now lay entirely in the hands of whatever god or spirit had sent this stranger across her path. The rider was close enough now that she could see he wore the wide-brimmed hat and leather chaps of a cowboy, not the blue uniform of a cavalry trooper. His horse was a sturdy bay gelding, well suited for long desert travel, and the pack animal behind him carried what looked like camping gear and supplies. As he approached the arroyo where she lay, he suddenly reined in his mount and sat perfectly still, scanning the area with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading the subtle signs of the wilderness. Jake Morrison had been riding fence for the Double T Ranch for the better part of a week, checking for breaks in the wire and looking for strayed cattle in this remote corner of Arizona territory. He was 26 years old, lean and weathered by years of outdoor work, with steady blue eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest labor. The son of a homesteader who had died when Apache raiders hit their farm 12 years earlier. Jake had every reason to hate the native peoples of this land, but time and experience had taught him that hatred was a luxury he couldn't afford in a place where survival often depended on understanding rather than animosity. Something about the rocks ahead didn't look right to his experienced eye. There was a patch of color that didn't belong, brown and red fabric among the gray stones. Jake eased his Winchester rifle from its saddle scabbard and rode closer, ready for trouble but hoping he was wrong about what he might find. As the scene came into focus, he saw what appeared to be a young woman lying motionless beside the dry stream bed, her long black hair spread across the rocky ground like spilled ink. His first instinct was caution. This could be a trap. Apache warriors were known for their cunning, and using a seemingly helpless woman as bait was not beyond their tactical thinking. But as he circled closer, keeping his rifle ready, Jake could see that this was no ambush. The woman was clearly near death from exposure and dehydration. Her lips cracked and bleeding, her skin burned by the relentless sun. Her clothing was torn and stained with blood from numerous cuts and scrapes, and she lay so still that he wondered if he might already be too late. Jake dismounted and approached on foot, speaking in a low, calm voice. "Easy there, miss. I'm not going to hurt you." He could see now that she was indeed Apache, probably no more than 18 or 19 years old, and obviously one of the survivors from the village that had been attacked several days earlier. The story had already spread among the ranchers and townspeople. Another Indian raid put down by the cavalry, though Jake had heard enough conflicting accounts to suspect the truth was more complicated than the official version. Ayana's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, and for a moment they stared at each other across a gulf that seemed wider than the desert itself. He was a white man, one of the people responsible for destroying her world, yet his voice held no threat, no anger. His blue eyes showed concern rather than hatred, and his rifle was pointed safely away from her. She tried to speak, to ask for water, but her throat was too dry to produce more than a whispered croak. Understanding her need without words, Jake quickly returned to his horse and retrieved his water canteen. He knelt beside her and carefully lifted her head, supporting it with one hand while he held the canteen to her lips with the other. "Slow now," he murmured as she tried to gulp the precious liquid. "Too much too fast will make you sick." The water was warm and tasted of metal, but to Ayana it was sweeter than honey, bringing her parched tissues back to life with each small sip. As the water worked its magic, strength began to flow back into her limbs, and her vision cleared enough to get a better look at her rescuer. He was younger than she had first thought, probably not much older than herself, with sandy brown hair and a face marked by sun and wind rather than cruelty. His clothes were worn but clean, and his hands, though rough from work, were gentle as they helped her drink. Most surprisingly, he seemed to know exactly how to care for someone suffering from severe dehydration, controlling her intake and watching for signs of distress. "My name's Jake," he said once she had drunk her fill and was able to sit up with his support. "Jake Morrison. I work for the Double T Ranch about 15 miles south of here." He gestured toward the distant mountains. "What's your name and how long have you been out here?" His voice carried a slight accent that Ayana couldn't identify, not the harsh tones of the soldiers who had destroyed her village, but something softer, almost musical. It took several attempts before she could manage to speak, her voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. Ayanna. 4 days. The English words felt strange on her tongue after speaking only Apache for so long, but her grandfather had insisted that she learn the white man's language, saying it might one day save her life. Looking at this cowboy now, she realized how prophetic those words had been. Jake nodded, understanding immediately what those 4 days had meant. He had seen the smoke rising from the direction of the Apache village several days earlier, had heard the distant sound of gunfire carried on the wind. Like most of the ranchers in the territory, he had mixed feelings about the ongoing conflict between the army and the native tribes. He understood the settlers' need for security, but he had also seen enough of frontier justice to know that it was rarely as clean and simple as the newspapers made it sound. "Are you hurt anywhere besides cuts and scrapes?" he asked, examining her torn feet and the numerous abrasions on her arms and legs. "Can you move your arms and legs?" When she nodded weakly, he continued, "Good. I've got some medical supplies with my gear. Nothing fancy, but enough to clean those cuts and bandage your feet." He paused, studying her face in the afternoon light. "Are you the only survivor?" The question brought fresh pain to Ayanna's eyes, and Jake immediately regretted asking it. She turned away, staring out at the empty desert as if she might see her lost family walking toward her across the shimmering sand. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean close to hear the words. "I do not know. Others ran different ways." She looked back at him then, and he was struck by the depth of loss in her dark eyes. "My grandmother, my cousins, they did not run." Jake felt a familiar anger building in his chest, not at this girl or her people, but at the circumstances that had brought them to this point. He had lost his own family to violence, understood the hollow ache of being suddenly, completely alone in the world. But he also knew that dwelling on such things would help neither of them right now. The immediate priority was getting Ayanna to safety and proper care. "Listen," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We need to get you out of this sun and get some food in you. I've got a camp set up about a mile from here in a canyon with shade and a spring. Can you ride if I help you up?" When she nodded, he stood and walked back to his horses, considering his options. Bringing an Apache woman to his camp was risky enough, but taking her to town or the ranch would be downright dangerous given the current tensions. The pack horse carried a small tent, cooking supplies, and enough food for several days. Jake had been planning to spend another week checking the remote sections of fence before returning to the ranch headquarters. The canyon where he had made camp was well hidden and defensible, with fresh water and good grass for the horses. It would do for now, until he could figure out a more permanent solution to Ayanna's situation. He fashioned a makeshift seat on the pack horse, securing his sleeping roll and some supplies to create a reasonably comfortable place for her to ride. Helping her to her feet was a slow process. Her legs were shaky from dehydration and exhaustion, and her cut feet could barely support her weight. But with his assistance, she managed to mount the horse and settle into the improvised saddle. The ride to Jake's camp took almost an hour, with frequent stops to let Ayanna rest and drink more water. She swayed dangerously in the saddle several times, forcing Jake to walk beside the pack horse with one hand ready to steady her. The canyon he had chosen was a narrow cleft in the red sandstone, invisible from more than a few dozen yards away, and accessible only through a winding passage that would be easily defended if necessary. The sight of the small spring bubbling up from the rocks brought tears to Ayanna's eyes. Here was more water than she had seen in 4 days, clear and cold and apparently endless. Jake helped her down from the horse and led her to the pool, where she knelt and drank deeply before splashing the blessed coolness over her face and arms. The simple act of washing away 4 days of dirt and dried blood made her feel almost human again. While she refreshed herself at the spring, Jake quickly erected his tent in a shady spot beneath an overhanging ledge and started a small fire using dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. From his supplies, he prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, along with some jerked beef that would be easier for her to digest than fresh meat. The familiar routines of making camp helped him think through the complications of his situation. Harboring an Apache fugitive could get him shot by soldiers or lynched by angry settlers, especially if anyone discovered her presence. But Jake had no intention of abandoning her to die in the desert, and taking her to town would be signing her death warrant. The territorial authorities had been very clear about their policy regarding Apache survivors. They were to be transported to the reservation in Florida, a journey that few completed alive. For now, at least, his canyon camp offered safety and time to consider options. As the sun began to set behind the canyon rim, painting the rock walls in shades of orange and gold. Ayana sat beside Jake's fire and ate her first real meal in 4 days. The food was simple but nourishing, and she could feel strength flowing back into her body with each bite. Her rescuer sat across from her, quietly tending the fire and giving her space to recover without pressure to talk or explain herself. "Why do you help me?" she finally asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Your people and my people, we are enemies." The question had been troubling her since he had first given her water. In her experience, white men viewed Apache as less than human, obstacles to be removed rather than people worthy of compassion. Jake poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. "Maybe some folks see it that way," he said after a long pause. "But I figure we're all just trying to get by in a hard country. You didn't choose to be born Apache any more than I chose to be born white. And right now, you need help. That's enough reason for me." He looked across the flames at her, his expression serious. "Besides, I've got my own reasons for not trusting everything the army says about Indians." Something in his tone suggested a deeper story, personal experience that had shaped his views. Ayana wanted to ask more, but exhaustion was overtaking her, as the warmth of the fire and the food in her belly combined to relax muscles that had been tense with fear and pain for 4 long days. Jake seemed to understand her weariness without words. "You need rest," he said, standing and moving toward the tent. "You can take the tent tonight. I'll sleep by the fire and keep watch." When she started to protest, he held up a hand. "No arguments. You've been through hell, and you need real sleep to heal properly. Morning's time enough to worry about what comes next." As Ayana settled into Jake's bedroll inside the small tent, she found herself overwhelmed by emotions she had been too focused on survival to feel. Grief for her lost family, fear for her uncertain future, and something else, a tentative gratitude toward this unlikely savior who had appeared when all hope seemed lost. Through the canvas walls, she could hear him moving quietly around the camp, banking the fire and checking on the horses. For the first time in 4 days, she felt truly safe. The canyon walls rose protectively around them. The spring provided life-giving water, and a man she had every reason to distrust had instead shown her kindness that defied all her expectations. As sleep finally claimed her, Ayana wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether this fragile sanctuary could last in a world where her very existence was considered a threat to be eliminated. Dawn broke slowly in the hidden canyon, filtering down through the narrow opening above to paint the red sandstone walls in soft shades of pink and gold. Ayana woke gradually, her body still heavy with exhaustion but no longer racked by the desperate thirst and hunger that had driven her to the edge of death. For a moment, she lay still in Jake's bedroll, listening to the gentle sound of the spring and the distant nickering of horses, hardly daring to believe that her rescue hadn't been just another fever dream. Outside the tent, she could hear Jake moving around the camp, the soft sounds of someone trying not to wake a sleeping companion. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the canvas, making her stomach growl with genuine hunger rather than the gnawing emptiness of starvation. When she finally emerged from the tent, she found him crouched beside the fire, tending a skillet of eggs and meat with the practiced ease of someone long accustomed to cooking for himself. "Morning," he said, with a smile that seemed to light up the shadowy canyon. "Hope you slept better than you have in a while." He gestured toward the spring. "Water's fresh and clean if you want to wash up before breakfast. I set some soap and a clean shirt on that rock over there. Figured you might want to get out of those torn clothes." His considerate thoughtfulness continued to surprise her, challenging everything she had been taught about the nature of white men. The opportunity to truly bathe was a luxury Ayana hadn't expected to experience again. She gathered the soap and clean shirt, one of Jake's spare work shirts, which would be large on her but infinitely better than her torn and blood-stained Apache dress, and made her way to the spring. The water was shockingly cold but wonderfully refreshing, washing away not just the dirt and dried blood but some of the horror of the past 4 days. As she scrubbed her long black hair and watched 4 days of accumulated grime swirl away in the current, Ayana found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. Yesterday morning she had been dying alone in the desert, abandoned by hope and ready to join her ancestors. Now she was bathing in fresh water, wearing clean clothes, and preparing to share a meal with a man whose very existence challenged her understanding of the world. When she returned to the fire, Jake handed her a tin plate heaped with eggs, bacon, and fried bread. The food was simple but expertly prepared, seasoned with wild herbs that showed his knowledge of the desert's hidden resources. They ate in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts as the morning sun climbed higher and drove the shadows deeper into the canyon walls. "We need to talk about what happens next," Jake finally said, setting down his empty plate and refilling their coffee cups. "I can't keep you hidden here forever, and winter's coming on. You'll need better shelter and more supplies than I can provide." He paused, studying her face in the morning light. "Do you have any family left? Anyone who might have made it to safety?" The question brought back the pain of loss, but Ayana found she could think about it now without being overwhelmed by despair. "My uncle," she said slowly. "He was hunting in the mountains when the soldiers came. If he still lives, he would go to the old places, the hidden canyons our grandfathers used." She gestured toward the peaks visible through the canyon opening. "But I do not know if he survived, or if he would accept me if he did. I am changed now." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Changed how?" When she struggled to find the English words, he waited patiently, recognizing the difficulty of expressing complex thoughts in a second language. Finally, she looked up at him with eyes that held depths of sorrow and wisdom far beyond her 18 years. "I have eaten the white man's food, slept under his protection, accepted his kindness," she said quietly. "Some of my people would say I am no longer Apache, that I have become something else, something between two worlds that belongs fully to neither." The pain in her voice was evident, the fear that she might have lost not just her family but her very identity in the process of survival. "That's foolish talk," Jake said firmly, surprising himself with the vehemence of his response. "You're the same person you were 5 days ago. The same person you were before any of this happened. What you've been through, what you've had to do to survive, that doesn't change who you are inside." He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense with conviction. "Anyone who can't see that isn't worth worrying about." His words sparked something in Ayana that had been dormant since the attack, a flicker of hope, of self-worth that the trauma hadn't quite managed to extinguish. She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motive, but found only sincerity and an understanding that seemed to come from his own experience of loss and displacement. "You speak as one who knows," she observed. "What happened to your family?" She had noticed his reaction when she mentioned being alone in the world, the way his expression had briefly revealed old pain before he carefully controlled it again. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if he could see the past dancing in the flames. "Apache raiders hit our homestead when I was 14, he said finally. "Killed my parents and little sister, burned everything we'd built." He looked up at her then, his face carefully neutral. "I spent a lot of years hating all Apache for what those warriors did. Took me longer than it should have to realize that blaming you for their actions made about as much sense as you blaming me for what those soldiers did to your village." The revelation hit Ayana like a physical blow. Here was a man whose family had been destroyed by her people, who had every reason to hate her, yet he had risked his own safety to save her life. The complexity of their situation, the layers of historical grievance and personal loss that should have made them enemies, seemed to dissolve in the face of their shared humanity. "I am sorry," she said, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "I am sorry for your family, for your pain." She paused, struggling with emotions and concepts that had no easy translation. "And I am sorry that my being here brings you danger. If the soldiers find me with you, let me worry about the soldiers," Jake interrupted, though his tone remained gentle. "Right now, the important thing is getting you somewhere safe for the winter. Those mountains you mentioned, how long would it take to reach the places where your uncle might be hiding?" He was already calculating distances and supplies, his practical mind working on the logistics of what would essentially be an escape plan. Ayana considered the question carefully, visualizing the network of canyons and hidden valleys that honeycombed the high country. 2 weeks, maybe 3, if the weather turns bad. "But it is dangerous country, easy to get lost, and there are soldiers patrolling the main trails." She hesitated, then added, "And you cannot come with me. A white man in those places would be killed on sight, friend or enemy." "Maybe," Jake acknowledged, "but I can get you close enough to find your own way. I know those mountains pretty well myself, been hunting up there for years. There are back trails the army doesn't know about, places where a small party could move without being seen." He was already forming a plan, thinking through routes and campsites, supply caches, and potential obstacles. "Why would you do this?" Ayana asked, genuinely puzzled by his continued willingness to help. "You have done enough already, more than enough. Why risk more for someone you barely know? The question had been bothering her since she woke, this inexplicable kindness from a source she had been taught to fear and distrust. Jake stood and walked to the edge of the spring, staring up at the narrow strip of blue sky visible between the canyon walls. Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything and have nowhere to turn, he said quietly. Maybe because I'm tired of all the killing and want to do something that builds instead of destroys. He turned back to face her, his expression serious but determined. Or maybe I just think you deserve a chance to live your own life instead of dying for other people's hatred. The simple honesty of his answer moved Ayana in ways she hadn't expected. In her culture, actions spoke louder than words, and Jake's actions over the past day had already said more about his character than 100 speeches could have conveyed. But hearing him articulate his motivations, understanding the thought processes behind his kindness, created a connection between them that transcended the racial and cultural barriers that should have kept them apart. "When would we leave?" she asked, the question itself an acceptance of his offer. "And what of your work, your life at the ranch? You cannot simply disappear without questions being asked." The practical concerns were important, but she was also touched by his willingness to abandon his normal life to help her find hers. "I was planning to quit the double T anyway," Jake admitted with a slight grin. "Been thinking about moving on, maybe trying my luck in California or Colorado. This just gives me a good reason to make the break." He became more serious as he continued. "As for timing, we should leave tonight, travel at night, rest during the day. Harder on us, but less chance of being spotted by patrols or other travelers." The rest of the day passed quickly as they prepared for the journey ahead. Jake sorted through his supplies, keeping only the essentials and caching the rest in a hidden cave higher up the canyon. He showed Ayana how to load and fire his spare revolver, insisting that she needed to be able to defend herself if they were separated. The weapon felt strange and heavy in her hands, so different from the traditional weapons of her people. But she practiced with it until she could hit what she aimed at. As evening approached, they shared what might be their last peaceful meal for many days. The fire cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. Ayana found herself studying Jake's face in the flickering light, memorizing the details of his features, the way he moved, the sound of his voice. This man had saved her life and was now risking his own to help her find her people. Whatever happened in the mountains ahead, she would never forget his kindness. "Jake," she said suddenly, the name still unfamiliar on her tongue. "If something happens, if we are caught or separated," she struggled to find words for the gratitude that filled her heart. "I want you to know that you have given me more than life. You have given me hope." He reached across the fire and briefly touched her hand, the gesture simple but profound. "Just promise me something," he said quietly. "Whatever happens up there, don't let anyone convince you that you're less than you are. You're Apache, you're strong, you're a survivor." "Hold on to that." His eyes reflected the firelight as he added, "And maybe, when all this settles down, when the hatred cools and people start seeing sense again, maybe there'll be a place in this world for folks like us, people who choose friendship over fear." As they prepared to break camp and begin their dangerous journey into the mountains, Ayana felt something she hadn't experienced since before the attack on her village, genuine hope for the future. The road ahead would be treacherous, filled with soldiers, harsh weather, and the possibility of rejection by her own people. But she was no longer facing it alone. She had found an unexpected ally in the most unlikely place, and his faith in her had rekindled her own faith in herself. The stars were brilliant in the clear desert sky as they led the horses out of the canyon and began their trek toward the distant peaks. Behind them lay the ruins of their old lives. Ahead waited an uncertain future, but for now, in this moment between past and future, they had each other and the quiet satisfaction of choosing hope over hatred, compassion over fear. In a land torn by violence and misunderstanding, they had found something precious and rare, proof that even the deepest divisions could be bridged by human kindness and the simple recognition that beneath all the surface differences, they were simply two people trying to find their way home.